Good morning, everyone. Virgo Triad here. Happy Monday to everyone. It is April 8th, 2019. I want to talk to you guys about a few things that I've been thinking about over the weekend. There's some pretty serious subjects. They're things that we tend to go into on and off on this channel, but we really don't go in extreme depth the majority of the time. And there's reasons behind why I don't do that. One of the reasons is that I do not want people walking away from any of the podcasts that I do or anything that's done on YouTube with an overly negative feeling. That's been a serious concern of mine since the inception of the Virgo Triad channel because of the fact that we are dealing with scams. But today, after dealing with some things over the weekend, I'm seeing a need in order to pull you into a podcast, and that's what this one is. This is not a regular video. This is going to be a podcast that is going to walk through some things that are cult-related, take you through an article that was done by the New York Times last week with regard to the sovereign citizen movement and the financial scams and money that they have gotten away with stealing. We're going to be talking about a very strongly worded comment that I received over the weekend that was very it was very nice to hear, but also very discouraging. That particular comment is one that makes the statement that the determined alt-right to bring down the federal government, to spread lies, to spread cult-like mentality amongst vulnerable listeners on YouTube and people on Facebook and Twitter are spreading mental illness, and they are, and this has been going on for years, and so this is something we're going to be discussing today, and I want to start out with the definition of cult, and cult is technically defined as a group that tends to manipulate, exploit, and control its members, and of course there are a lot of different directions that a cult can go. But the main three things that a cult does are to exploit, to manipulate, and to control their members. And we see that largely with this movement. Now, when I say, I'm going to make this absolutely clear. So any of you sovereign citizens out there listening to me, hear me well. I don't call a person specifically a sovereign citizen necessarily on this show. I am calling the movement the sovereign citizen movement. I don't care whether you think it's an oxymoron or not. I didn't coin the phrase. Your leaders did. Sovereign citizen movement is something that was come up with by the sovereign citizens themselves back in the 70s and 80s. I don't really give a damn whether or not you find that to be an oxymoron. Okay, because the truth is that was not a phrase that was coined by the government. That was not a phrase that was coined by any other individual within the government. It was coined by the sovereign citizen movement itself. True fact. So, I'm not going to go any further with that. We are going to take a look at this article that the New York Times wrote. I'm going to go ahead and read through the article for you, or at least a portion of it. And then I will link it in the description of this video so that way you guys can look at it for yourself should you choose to. It's very alarming. It's very concerning. And I think everybody really needs to start paying very close attention to what this movement actually is doing to your internet, how it's playing a role in the potential of censorship of freedom of speech in the future, how it is playing a role in your politics, and how it is playing a role in the people that you care for and you love and family members of yours potentially that are watching YouTube videos and Facebook videos that are telling them outright lies. The name of the article that I'm going to be reading for you is How Sovereign Citizens Helped Swindle $1 billion from the Government That They Disavow. Before I get started here, let me make a statement. The movement largely disavows the government all the way across the board, whether it's tax protesters or those that run these financial scams like the supposed TDA accounts. The movement largely goes out as a cult to bring in new members, mostly people who are vulnerable because they simply do not understand the way economics works. They simply do not understand the way that finance works. They have a very difficult time understanding government's history in our nation. They are not lawyers. They are not people who understand what the legalities actually are with regards to commerce, for example. So if they can find a good portion of people who are angry and upset because they've gotten themselves in debt, because they have put themselves in a position that they feel after listening to these people that they have been set up for. They've been set up for failure, for example, in their own minds. Then there's someone to blame. And people that have potential mental illness and people who are very upset about the position that they find themselves in have a tendency to find it necessary or easier to blame someone else rather than let the responsibility fall on them. Now, the majority of us are aware that if we overspend and we can't pay off our debt, that puts us in debt and that makes us responsible for what we have done. We have to take responsibility for that and make a decision. If we are too far under, then we may have to actually file a bankruptcy, and we may have to suffer that indignity for a 7-year period on our credit report, and we may have to rebuild from there. And then those are others of us that have not gotten so deeply embedded and have caught ourselves to where we can go in and we can actually correct the problem. It may take 2 or 3 years to get ourselves out of debt. It may take 5 to 10 years to get ourselves out of debt. But we realize that we have to correct it for ourselves because we were the ones who actually caused it for ourselves. There's a group of people out there, and I have been studying this group of people for over 2 years now. And I have determined that it's about 30% of the nation that somehow feels so entitled that they feel that their mistakes should be other people's burdens. And that is largely what the sovereign citizen movement, those people are who they attempt to try to gather and rope in. And when they have convinced you, then they will steal from you. And for those of you that catch on to what's going on, a lot of times they will offer you a position in addition. I'm going to be reading this article to you today that was written by the New York Times. I'm not going to put it up on the screen because I don't want to violate copyright, but I am going to read it. And we will move on from there with a discussion, hopefully in the comments section, to where everybody can kind of get out what their feelings are with regards to this. This is the very first article that I've actually ever seen written to this magnitude. And I would like to thank a couple of people. One is Emma Willard for forwarding this on to me. The second would be Dave H. Both of you forwarded this New York Times article that is entitled How Sovereign Citizens Help Swindle $1 billion from the Government That They Disavow. It's written by Ashley Powers. It was written on March 29th of 2019, and I'm going to go ahead and read that now. One day in 2015, Barbara Lavender's husband returned home from a UFO conference and handed her a business card. It bore a red theater curtain background, a vintage microphone, and a gold and white lettering that read, Sean David Morton, radio host, public speaker, author, director, screenwriter, actor. Mr. Morton, Jeff Lavender told his wife, was a UFO royalty. Mr. Morton had spent years whisking ET-obsessed tourists to Area 51 for $99 a pop, then leveraged his following into stints on the weak hours conspiracy show Coast to Coast AM. At one point, the nation's number 3 talk radio program. He dabbed in other fringe arts, such as remote viewing and psychic predictions about earthquakes, elections, and the stock market. But by the time Mr. Lavender saw him talk in Southern California, Mr. Morton had shifted to something truly fantastical: instant debt relief. He'd been peddling a workshop called The Sovereign Factor. The revolution starts with you, a nod to what is known as the Sovereign Citizens Movement. A loose network of perhaps tens of thousands of far-right, anti-government extremists. Sovereigns share certain conspiratorial beliefs and sometimes a desire to profit off of a government whose legitimacy they completely deny. Do you realize, read Mr. Morton's workshop description, you are all considered incompetent, wards of the state, resistance, and the chattel property of the U.S. federal government until you declare your emancipation. Learn all the secrets about how to get the government off your back and out of your life once and for all. One of these secrets was called the bond process. By submitting the right set of papers, Mr. Morton said that you could wipe out your mortgage, tax bills, and student loans. Mr. Morton's message had appeal beyond the tinfoil hat crowd. In America, after the Great Recession, plenty of people were upside down in mortgages and student debt, and they were inclined to believe anyone offering help. Mrs. Lavender, listening to her husband recap the workshop, was intrigued. Years earlier, she'd borrowed $48,000 to help her son attend college. She and her husband had worked in the mortgage industry in Southern California for decades. But educational debt was unfamiliar terrain. I had never gone to college myself, she told me recently. I took out a loan I shouldn't have. Mrs. Lavender lost her job and deferred the payments, and the interest kept piling up. By the time she had held Mr. Morton's business card in her hand, she owed $70,000. She realized a UFO gathering was an unusual venue for debt relief advice. Her husband's annual get-togethers with the X-File crowd were a hobby for him and a good-natured punchline for their family. But the size and interactability of her loan balance weighed on her. Also, she trusted her husband, and he thought that Mr. Morton's bond process was worth checking out. She told me, I think he probably was enticed by it because it might have been a little tiny kick in the pants to the government. As the Lavenders came to discover, sovereign fraudsters are the snake oil salesmen of our time, peddling a bouquet of grifts as varied as tax fraud and real estate scams. They prey on our suspicion of institutions, financial illiteracy, greed, and despair. You don't even have to buy into sovereign dogma to get swindled. You just need to be, as Miss Lavender was, in debt. From 1990 to 2013, far-right extremists carried out more than 600 financial scams that resulted in criminal charges. According to the researchers who run the U.S. Extremist Financial Crime Database, which is affiliated with the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism and is the only clearinghouse of its kind, That adds up to conservatively public losses of $1 billion. The majority of perpetrators were either sovereigns or their ideological cousins, tax deniers. Fraud is to them what cross-burning is to white supremacists in expression or belief. Number 1. What sovereign citizens believe. Sovereigns, who sometimes call themselves freemen or state citizens, have no foundational document, but broadly they subscribe to an alternate version of American history. The tale can be varied from sovereign to sovereign, but it goes roughly like this. At some point, a corporation secretly usurped the United States government, then went bankrupt and sought aid from international bankers. As collateral, the corporation offered the financiers, us. As sovereigns tell you, the birth certificate and Social Security card are not benign documents, but contracts that enslave you. There is, they believe, a pathway to freedom. Renounce these contracts or otherwise assert your sovereignty. Mr. Morton said he once told the Social Security Administration, "I don't want this number." Then no one, not the taxman, not the police, can tell you what to do. Not all sovereigns are conmen, but their belief system lends itself to deceit. You might declare yourself a diplomat from a non-existent country. Mr. Morton represented the Republic of New Lemuria and the Dominion of Melchizedek. Or start a fake Native American tribe. Or blow off a court case because the American flag in the courtroom happens to have gold fringe. Some sovereigns have even lashed out violently at law enforcement officers, which is why they're considered a domestic terror threat. Many sovereign myths hark back to the creation in 1913 of the Federal Reserve. It was this weird, complicated instrument for controlling the monetary system. People saw it as sinister. The author J.M. Berger told me in a recent paper Mr. Berger traced the circulation of these ideas in part to a company named Omni Publications, which was something like the InfoWars of the middle of the 20th century. The Omni title, The Federal Reserve Conspiracy, claimed that enemy aliens had infiltrated the banking system and that their biographies could be found in a who's who in American Jewry. Sovereign lore is often rooted in anti-Semitism, by the way. By the 1970s, the intellectual father of the sovereign citizen movement, William Potter Gale, helped spread this type of falsehood to a much larger audience. The founder of the anti-government group Posse Comitatus, Mr. Gale aligned himself with an emerging movement of tax protesters who argued, for instance, that paying taxes was a form of involuntary servitude. In turn, he introduced them to his warped vision of America, where patriots establish their own legal system and hang those who defy it. Mr. Gale's specific gift was wrapping nonsense in enough legalese that it sounded real. If you have this movement that offers you essentially a lot of magic words that you can say to get out of trouble, that's going to really appeal to people who are desperate and angry, Mr. Berger said. Mr. Gale's outreach was a success. Over time, the line between thousands of tax protesters and Posse members blurred. Take redemption, a theory popularized in part by a Gale associate. Remember how the corporation/fake government used us as collateral? According to sovereign lore, this means the government set up secret accounts in our names. Some believe they contain the oddly specific amount of $630,000. To be clear, this is pure fantasy. according to the Internal Revenue Service, the Treasury, the FBI, you name it, it's pure fantasy. One way sovereigns try to make the imaginary money real is by abusing legitimate IRS forms. Law-abiding taxpayers use forms 1099/OID, for example, to report original issue discount income. But some sovereigns write in a fake OID income and fake withholding in order to claim illegitimate refunds. If you file such a return, you risk at the very least a large fine. Yet from 2012 to 2014, according to the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, the IRS received close to 7,000 sham OID filings. Chronically underfunded and understaffed, IRS investigators refer only about 24 sovereign scam cases on average for prosecution each year. The agency sometimes misses returns that could raise suspicion. For example, in 2016, the IRS discovered a sizable redemption scheme, but only after processing 207 bogus returns and dispersing more than $43 million. That's another reason these strange theories persist and have begun to leach out of the sovereign network and into the general population. Sometimes, improbably, they work. Number 2, they just went berserk. Mr. Morton was born in 1958, and his comfortable childhood in Northern California was a tutorial on how to make a sales pitch. His mother, Maureen Kennedy Solomon, was, as San Francisco Magazine once described her, a millionaire evangelical alternative medicine fanatic who promoted questionable cancer treatments. She was also a member of the John Birch Society, the far-right group known for its paranoid anti-communism, and she stockpiled beans and grains and ammunition in case of a Russian invasion. In 1984, she was chosen as a vice presidential nominee for the Populist Party, a favorite of white supremacists. Its presidential candidate the following cycle was the former Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard David Duke. In her acceptance speech, she warned the crowd, "We're up against the most evil and powerful conspiracy the world has ever known." When Mr. Morton reached adulthood, he sold unorthodox beliefs from behind a Suburban. A flop of dark hair, a round, clean-shaven face, and a button-down and khakis wardrobe, he was charismatic, but also childlike. Friends said his ego easily was bruised. He branded himself an investigative reporter within the UFO world, and in the 1990s, when Mr. Morton appeared on the Montel Williams show, he made outrageous claims. More than 100 alien species had visited Earth. With the certainty of a Nobel laureate. Yeah, here we go with my pronunciation, you guys. Excuse me. I got close enough to one of these things that was floating around in the desert to actually get my face burned by it, he said. Even other UFO enthusiasts considered him a kook, but Mr. Morton's fans didn't care. The truth was out there, and Sean David Morton had it. Branding himself a prophet, he plummeted the New Age convention circuit alongside specialists in animal telepathy, chakras, hauntings, angelic gemstone messages, and the afterlife. Near the end of the millennium, At the convention in Las Vegas, a blue-eyed, reddish-haired woman approached him. Back in Utah, Melissa Thompson had grown up in a Mormon home and married at 22 years old. She worked in banking and in her spare time doted on her pedigree cats, even serving as treasurer of the local cat fanciers group. The Coast to Coast program was her escape, and she spent hours fangirling over Mr. Morton, a frequent guest. I'm going to show you a picture of him. Here's a picture of Sean David Morton appearing on the Friends online talk show. At the Las Vegas convention, Mr. Thompson apparently had one goal, to meet, or Mrs. Thompson rather, apparently had one goal, to meet her idol. It was love at first sight, Mr. Morton said. She soon left her husband and joined Mr. Morton in Southern California. Her oldest brother, Robert, told me. The more we found out, the more we warned Melissa that he is just not a decent person at all. But he promised her movie roles. They'll inherit Mommy's home in Atherton, her condo in Tahoe. All she could see was dollars. When they got married, her family refused to attend. Through her lawyer, Mrs. Morton declined to comment. Mr. Morton did not respond to multiple requests for comment, although he said on YouTube last fall that the New York Times was conducting a massive smear campaign against him. Unless otherwise noted, all of his quotes in this article are from court records. The Mortons lived in Hermosa Beach, a surf spot about 20 miles from downtown Los Angeles, next to its mini palaces, their oatmeal-colored apartment building resembling servant quarters, but it was a short stroll to the Pacific Ocean. Mr. Morton welcomed his new wife's bushy-tailed Norwegian forest cats. When a new litter arrived, more than a dozen scampered around the apartment, and in turn she oversaw the administrative side of being Sean David Morton. He shilled conspiracy fiction, The Dark Prophet, Veil of the Antichrist CDs, Everything You Wanted to Know About the Future Volume 2, a $65 newsletter with thousands of subscribers, tomorrow's headlines today. Either this wasn't particularly lucrative, or it wasn't lucrative enough to replicate Mr. Morton's childhood wealth. From the outside, it was hard to tell. He was always asking me to try and help him do something so that he could raise some money, said Susan Shimsky, a fellow fixture on the New Age circuit. Like, let's do a trip to Peru so I can have some money. Let's do a teleseminar so that I can make some money. Mrs. Morton's pedigree kittens, which sold for hundreds of dollars each, apparently kept them solvent. At various points, she also dog-walked and worked at Disneyland. Their friend, Will Chappell, said it was him leading the charge, him leading the family. She did what was necessary to accomplish his goals. Early in their relationship, a website called UFO Watchdog, exposing the parasite's delusional personalities, morons, and frauds currently clouding the UFO issue, dismantled much of Mr. Morton's official biography. Mr. Morton sued. The case was dismissed. But in an email included in the case file, Mrs. Morton waved off the findings. I would only be concerned if Sean didn't have critics. Some of the greatest people in history have had people attacking them at every step. It just means that Sean is doing something right and trying to make a difference in the world. By 2006, the couple was expecting a windfall. Mrs. Salomon was in poor health. When she died, Mr. Morton assumed he'd inherit some of his mother's fortune. But their relationship, already frosty, iced over in her final weeks. Mrs. Salomon didn't even want her son and his wife to visit. She cut them both out of her will, even as she kept a $100,000 trust for her Great Dane Duke. They just both went berserk. Mrs. Morton's brother recalled, It's just been scam after scam after scam. Number 3, a deposit from the government for $500,000. While the sovereign citizen movement is inherently not organized, some members of the firmament became known as gurus and are vectors for spreading the ideology. Mr. Morton often lectured at the Living Temple, a New Age shop just south of Hermosa Beach. The owner favored a black t-shirt with 5 flying saucers and a statement that said, "Keep looking up," and yoga music through a clutter of bottles, bags of herbal something, Miracle Cleanse guidebooks, and Crop Circle DVDs. One day, most likely in 2008, a man named Brandon Adams started showing up. Unlike Mr. Morton, he was a budding sovereign amplifier. But he was so much younger that his untucked button-downs looked like an attempt at playing dress-up. His family ran a local tax prep business. His whole thing was the banks. Mr. Morton said later he was considered the great criminal conspiracy between the Internal Revenue Service and the banking cartels. Mr. Morton quickly got him a speaking slot. Some of Mr. Adams' talks were recorded, pacing in front of a few dozen people, scribbling phrases and stick figures on a whiteboard. He wove a dark tale, the secret bankruptcy, the people as collateral, then a twist. The banks were skimming money from or fractionalizing every transaction we make. He told the group they could reclaim the funds via Form 1099 OID. From a folding chair, Mr. Morton, looking grayer and rounder than during his Montel Williams days, asked Mr. Adams if anyone had already gotten a big refund that way. Yes, Mr. Adams said, the funny thing is, watch how quiet people start to get when they're not so sure about the process and they do not get the returns. Oh, and they do start getting the returns, excuse me. Laughter. They've got that mentality. I'm not going to say I just got 250 grand. The audience lapping it up. This was America during the financial crisis. The banks had been bailed out, but not homeowners, and the era of the Tea Party rallies and Occupy Wall Street was imminent. It wasn't too much of a leap to suspect that Washington was in cahoots with the likes of J.P. Morgan. Mr. Adams' Living Temple talks drew large enough crowds that he moved to a bigger venue and sold private coaching for $200 an hour. It became a movement, really. Mr. Morton said Mr. Adams did not respond to multiple requests for comments. In the spring of 2009, under Mr. Adams, the Mortons tried the OID scheme themselves. Mr. Morton filed 4 years of returns from 2005 to 2008 and claimed nearly $4 million in refunds. His wife filed a 2007 return and claimed about $12,000. I never, ever, ever in any of this thought that I was breaking a law, Mr. Morton said later. I thought that this was the law. His faith was bolstered when that April he got a refund for one of his returns, a direct deposit to their Washington Mutual account of $480,000. Number 4. Rich people find loopholes. Why not us? In 2010, the Securities and Exchange Commission went after the Mortons for a different scheme, one with no connection to sovereign ideology. Mr. Morton had used his unconventional celebrity a few years earlier to begin an investment club where he would channel his psychic powers into predicting foreign currency markets. It's a risky type of trading, but Mr. Morton bragged that his forecasts were so accurate that even Henry Paulson, then the Treasury Secretary, relied on them. After hearing Mr. Morton promote the fund on Coast to Coast, A man from Washington State invested $217,000. An elderly New York woman parted with $20,000. He's promising the stars, recalled Tim Saunders, an Alaskan electrician who poured in his life savings of $135,000. Yeah, my greed came out, and I felt I needed more, and quickly. In all, more than 100 people invested $6 million. Mr. Morton sank only half into foreign currency trading, nearly all of which he lost. At least $240,000 was funneled to a nonprofit the Mortons set up themselves, and authorities don't know where the rest is. In 2013, the SEC won an $11.5 million judgment against him. Mrs. Morton was a relief defendant, meaning she was accused only of profiting from the scheme. The Mortons filed for bankruptcy but repeatedly misled the government, for instance, when they claimed not to have bank accounts. A court eventually denied their discharge, meaning they couldn't get rid of their debt. They were also tossed out of their beach-adjacent apartment. Bottom line, Mrs. Morton told the bankruptcy trustee one day, "I just want to be able to get a decent job, have a nice place to live, pay my taxes, and just have my life back." It was around this time that the Mortons turned to hawking the debt erase sovereign scheme known as the bond process. Over 2 years, they helped people around the country send nearly 24 fake bonds to the IRS, Quicken Loans, Penny Mac, Bank of America, Chase Bank, and the Treasurer's Office in Contra Costa County, California. Early in 2015, Barbara Lavender, the woman whose husband met Mr. Morton at the UFO conference, gave him a call. Miss Lavender is 61 and a front desk clerk at an adult school. When I met her last year in Hemet, California, nearly 90 parched miles east of Los Angeles, her ranch-style home was trimmed in red Christmas lights. We chatted at her kitchen table with her 14-year-old dog, Remy, curled up at our feet. She explained that when she spoke to Mr. Morton on the phone, he avoided talking about sovereign ideology. Instead, he said she should purchase a portion of a bond that he held and almost magically make her educational loan disappear. To wipe out her $70,000 balance, he suggested Miss Lavender should send him $2,500 or less than 4% of what she owed. She and her husband believed Mr. Morton had discovered the sort of workaround that supposedly rich people find. You know, she testified later, you hear it all the time, wealthy with tax loops and that kind of thing. The bond looked authentically bureaucratic and a formal scalloped border. It was really certificate paper had been purchased from Office Depot. The accompanying paperwork said that the student loan company was entitled to be paid back from a fund that in reality the United States taps into to help stabilize foreign currencies. Mr. Morton said he warned Miss Lavender, "Look, I don't know if this is going to work. I'm not a lawyer." He added, "It's all going to depend on whether or not they accept it." A month after the Mortons mailed the bond package, Miss Lavender checked her educational loan balance and saw that it had not budged, and wrote Miss Morton an email. She didn't get a response. Miss Lavender sent follow-up after follow-up. This is beginning to feel increasingly more like a scam. She wrote that October, where we built out of hard-earned money, we did not have to spare. Miss Morton finally replied and said she'd been recovering from knee surgery. Miss Lavender sent an almost apologetic response. Her attention was elsewhere. Her husband had died suddenly from a brain mass. Once you hear from Sean, can you let me know what he thinks we should do next? She wrote. With my husband gone, this debt is now an even greater burden to me, as he was the main breadwinner. Nothing came of the exchange. That winter, 2 men in jackets showed up at Miss Lavender's home and questioned her about the Mortons, the bond process, the outcome. Afterward, Miss Lavender took one of their business cards to her nephew who works for the local sheriff's office. Yes, he reassured her, they really are from the IRS. Number 5. The Conspiracy Cruise. On January 31st, 2016, a nearly 200-foot-tall white and blue cruise ship called the Ruby Princess docked at the port of Los Angeles. About 100 guests on board had paid $3,000 each for what was marked as a conspiracy cruise, a week-long jaunt through Mexican waters and American paranoia from vaccinations. Do you really know what's coming through that needle? To conspiracy to steal your body and soul. As the Mortons prepared to disembark, they were arrested by federal agents. After years of digging the IRS investigators, the Mortons faced a suit of charges related to their tax filings and fake bonds. Once off the Ruby Princess, where Mr. Morton had led a workshop called From Fascism to Freedom, they were separated, patted down, and asked what medications they took. Mr. Morton said to ask Melissa about his. An agent did. Cyanide, she said, seething. On the way to jail, she added, "Do me a favor and tell Sean this. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next life." Their trial began just before Tax Day 2017. The prosecution told a simple story of greed. "I submit the IRS was a slot machine," one prosecutor, Valerie Makarowitz, said. "Keep hitting spin. Keep playing until you hit that jackpot." The same day the Mortons got their $480,000 refund, she said, they went to the bank and drained nearly all of their account. Once the IRS realized its mistake and tried to recoup the money, the Mortons filed 2 more rounds of bogus returns and set of fake bonds. Mrs. Morton's lawyer presented a good faith defense. She was under the thrall of sovereign gurus, she said, people who kind of struttle back and forth on the stage with an answer for everything. He showed the jury 37 pages of perfect cursive notes Miss Morton took at a Brandon Adams lecture. In this courtroom, it's obviously nonsense, but at that time people believed it, and Melissa Morton believed it. Mr. Morton represented himself. "I'm not a rapist, a thug, or a war criminal," he said during his opening statement. "I didn't run a Nazi concentration camp and murder millions of children." Serving as his own lawyer also meant he cross-examined witnesses. "Are you familiar with the bankruptcy of the United States in 1933? He asked the government's fraud expert. It was a reference to the sovereign conspiracy theory. "No," the witness said, "I am not." During this closing argument, the trial's 4th day, Mr. Morton told the jury about the Norwegian forest cats. Earlier in the week, he said he and his wife tried to save a premature kitten. They stayed up late, swaddled her in cloth, fed her milk with an eyedropper. The kitten died anyway. Ask yourselves, he implored the jurors, do we send these nice people who care for kittens and raise kittens to jail forever? The panel deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, Mrs. Morton greeted them with a hopeful smile. The verdict, guilty on all counts. She fainted. Around this time, other prominent sovereigns were facing a reckoning. A court had permanently barred Mr. Adams from preparing tax returns or promoting the OID scheme. He ended up in prison for peddling fake money orders. Another guru on the conspiracy cruise named Winston Shrout, workshop Conspiracy of the Court System, was awaiting trial in Oregon. Mr. Morton's sentencing was set for that June, but when the 11 a.m. hearing started, he didn't show. Number 6. A post-eclipse poolside bust. Agents spotted him that afternoon outside a Domino's in Hermosa Beach, a gray hood and sunglasses shrouding much of his face. He hopped in his white Ford Escape and headed south. The next morning, he tweeted a plea for donations. Melissa and the cats need help relocating. 2 months passed. Mr. Morton resurfaced via video on his friend's online talk show, Project Camelot, getting the truth out one whistleblower at a time. His hair was mussed as if he'd been startled awake, and he wore a headset, a black V-neck, a dark-rimmed glasses, and he took on and off. His version of hello was ripping his judge and prosecutors as the biggest gang of criminals you ever are going to see. Soon he turned his attention to the impending solar eclipse. This is one of the biggest turn points in American history, he said. The video clocked more than 40,000 views. It was vintage Sean David Morton, which is to say it was impossible to tell what, if anything, he believed. I once asked Will Chappell, who has known the Mortons for more than a decade, whether they were actual sovereign dogmatists. He said, she definitely believed in the story that Sean was telling. I believe that Sean believed in the story he was telling. A little bit I believed it, and now, after their convictions, Melissa, of course, knowing what she knows now, she would have been gone a long time ago. I think Sean would have still gone and done what he did. He still thinks he just missed a step. The solar eclipse took place in August, the week after Mr. Morton's On the Lam interview. Though Mrs. Morton promised the court she would have no contact with her fugitive husband, the couple rendezvoused at a hotel just outside Palm Springs. That morning, after the moon briefly blotted out the sun, Mr. Morton was lounging poolside in swim trunks, purple mountains arrayed above him. Eclipse glasses at his side, an IRS agent walked up. It was over. At their sentencing, Mrs. Morton distanced herself from him. I am a living embodiment of love is blind, she wrote to the judge. If I ever questioned the teaching and processes of others, I was told who was I to question others who were far smarter than I was. There were thousands of attendees to the workshops and seminars. It was so convincing, well organized, and very believable. How could thousands of people be wrong? She was sentenced to 2 years in prison and has filed an appeal. Behind bars, she passed time taking classes, resume writing, watercolor painting, embroidery, and watching the Food Network. She was recently transferred to a halfway house. Emails posted on the Project Camelot site suggested she and her husband are still in touch. Mr. Morton was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He's representing himself on appeal, and in court papers he argued that he'd been improperly profiled as a terrorist sovereign citizen. On Project Camelot, his unrepentant, even sharing a pardon request he said he sent to President Trump. It's because of my work in radio and TV investigative journalism that deep state forces within the Department of Justice put my wife and I in prison for years, he wrote. Of course, he had a suggestion for how to correct this injustice. Just donate to his PayPal account. I would like for you guys to open up discussion in the comment section with regards to this. I know it was long, and I know I made a few mistakes in it, and I apologize for that. I felt that it was important that for those of you that don't have the time to read the article that I will actually link in the description below this video for yourselves. It's very, very lengthy. I thought it would be easier if somebody read it to you so you could listen to it on the way to work or on the way home, perhaps. This is becoming an increasing problem. There are so many people that are on the internet now that don't even know what a sovereign citizen movement is, that believe in these lies. There are people that are walking around that believe that there was a bankruptcy that never actually occurred in the United States. There are people that are listening to YouTube videos just because they roll into that video after that someone was watching. For example, the other day, showed up on my channel. Somebody had been watching recipes, and somehow or another it rolls into an old Winston Shrout video, and they listen to an hour and a half of Winston Shrout talking about these bonds because supposedly your birth certificate is monetized. A complete and total lie and fabrication. I mean, unbelievable lie. So this person decides, oh my gosh, I've never heard of such a thing. I'm going to start researching who this party is, and ended up on my channel. How sad that they waste probably a full day of their life because this guy is telling lies about supposedly how you can turn your birth certificate in for thousands of dollars. These individuals that are of the alt-right sovereign citizen movement will stop at absolutely nothing to try and convince anyone that they can that their BS is true. It isn't just about stealing from you as a person, although that is a perk that they love. It's about an attempt to try to get you to distrust the government more than you probably already do, because that sets them at a stage where they could potentially bring the government down. Now, making the government smaller is one thing. Bringing it down entirely is something I don't think most people recognize as something that could potentially happen. But you know what? If we don't pay closer attention to what is happening around us, to family members that are listening to fringe theories that are not true, it's a very real prospect. And we could very easily end up in an authoritarian type of scenario if we don't pay close attention to what's happening. These people, make no mistake, are terrorists. Some of them are terrorists from a physical standpoint that you would need to be concerned about whether or not they're going to blow up a building. But most of them are financial terrorists and con artists. And we have almost all of them right here on YouTube. I hope everybody enjoyed today's video. I know it was lengthy. I appreciate it very much if you would talk about this, communicate about this in the comment section, and perhaps we'll do another podcast talking about these things within the next few days to address any questions that anyone might have or any subjects that anyone wants to actually discuss about this. This has to come up more in regular discussion. It's uncomfortable. And it's very difficult from the standpoint of being on this side of it because there are threats that come in when I do these types of videos in mass amounts. As I said, these people will stop at nothing to attempt to try to disillusion people, to attempt to try to sell their snake oil. But I would not be doing what is right from a civic standpoint if I did not say we have to seriously start looking at this in a real way. It's a danger, and it's a very, very big one in the current setting that we are in right now in this country. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.